The sound came first. A hollow metallic clatter, a can of beans hitting a linoleum floor, and then the kind of silence that only happens when a room full of people collectively decides not to react. Not the silence of shock, the silence of choice. 23 people were inside Millmart that Wednesday morning. 23 people watched a 71-year-old woman go down hard on a grocery store floor. Not one of them said a word. The man who put her there didn't even look back. He just kept walking. But here is what that man didn't know, what none of those 23 people knew as they stood in their frozen, shameful quiet. The woman lying on that floor didn't need a single one of them to speak up for her. She didn't need a hero. She didn't need a witness. She needed 30 seconds and a phone with 3 numbers saved in it. That's all. And before we get to what happened next, before we get to the 28 motorcycles, before we get to a town that woke up one morning and found itself surrounded on every side, before we get to the moment, a man who had never once been told no in his life finally heard it said out loud in front of everyone. You need to understand who Ruth Calloway actually was, not who Millhaven thought she was, who she actually was. Millhaven, Oklahoma sits on a stretch of US 270 that most people pass through without stopping. Population just under 4,000. One grocery store and one pharmacy, one diner, one bar, one gas station, and a post office that closes at noon on Fridays. The kind of town where the same families have owned the same properties for 3 generations, where everybody knows your name, but not necessarily your story, and where the unspoken rules about who gets respect and who doesn't have been in place so long that most people stopped questioning them years ago. Ruth Calloway had lived at the end of Maple Street for 7 years. She had a small house with a covered front porch, a garden that ran along the south fence, and 3 potted geraniums she kept by the front steps year-round. She drove a 2009 Ford Ranger that she'd bought used and maintained herself. She went to the grocery store twice a week, Tuesdays and Wednesdays, always in the morning, always with a handwritten list. She paid her bills on time. She didn't belong to the church, women's group, or the garden club, or any of the other organizations that structured social life in Millhaven. She kept to herself. Not coldly she'd wave to you, she'd hold a door, she'd stop and talk if you stopped first. But she didn't push her way into conversations, didn't volunteer her opinions, didn't seem to need the town's approval to feel settled in her own skin. The people of Millhaven knew her the way you know a landmark. The woman at the pharmacy knew she liked peppermint candies. The mail carrier knew she left a cold bottle of water on the porch railing every summer morning. The kids on Maple Street knew that if your bike tire went flat anywhere within 2 blocks, Mrs. Calloway could fix it with her hands, and whatever she had in the small toolbox she kept just inside her garage door. Nobody knew much beyond that. Nobody asked. She had a left knee that gave her trouble, had for years, and she walked with a slight hitch when the weather turned cold or when she'd been on her feet too long. She wore the same style of clothes most days, flannel shirts in the cooler months, cotton button-downs in summer-worn, leather work shoes that had seen better days, but fit her feet exactly right. Her hair had gone fully silver sometime in her 60s, and she wore it pulled back simply without fuss. She looked to the casual eye like exactly what Millhaven assumed. She was a quiet old widow, living out her years in a small town where nothing much happened. They were half right. She was quiet. She was a widow. And she had chosen Millhaven specifically because nothing much happened there, because after a life that had taken her across 7 states through losses that would have broken a lesser person, through years of being the kind of woman you had to be when you were married to the kind of man Roy Calloway was, after all of that, she had wanted more than anything the simple mercy of ordinary days. What the town of Millhaven did not know about Ruth Calloway could fill a book. Roy Calloway, her husband of 31 years, dead now for 7, had not been an ordinary man. He'd been Roy Iron Calloway, one of the founding members of the largest Hells Angels chapter in the southern United States, a man whose name was known from Oklahoma down through Texas like a weather system, and whose code of conduct, the actual written rules he'd put together for how members of his chapter were supposed to carry themselves, was still being referenced long after his death. He hadn't been a criminal. That was the part people always got wrong when they made assumptions about men like Roy. He'd been a builder in his own way, someone who created loyalty, structure, and belonging out of nothing for men who had nowhere else to belong. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in 2017 on a stretch of highway outside Tulsa when a truck drifted across the center line. The driver of the truck walked away. Roy did not. The investigation concluded it was an accident. Ruth accepted that conclusion the way she'd learned to accept most of the things life handed her, not easily and not quickly, but with a thoroughness that meant she didn't have to pick it back up again later. She sold the house in Tulsa, packed what mattered, and drove to Millhaven. Small town, quiet, nobody who knew her name. She wanted to grow old in peace. She didn't advertise who she was. Not because she was ashamed. Ruth Calloway had never once in her life been ashamed of who she was or where she come from. But she understood at 71 that the past doesn't need to follow you into every room. The people who mattered already knew, and the people who didn't know didn't need to. On the kitchen table next to the salt shaker and the ceramic rooster she'd had since her 30s, there sat a small green notebook. She wrote in it most evenings after dinner in the quiet of the house. No one had ever asked her what she wrote. She had never offered to explain. That notebook would matter, but that comes later. 1 week before the morning everything changed, Ruth Calloway had been standing at her front gate watching a 9-year-old boy walk home. His name was Cody Reeves. He lived 3 houses down with his grandmother, a good woman named Patrice, who worked double shifts at the nursing home on Route 9. Cody was small for his age and wore glasses with thick frames that were always slightly crooked, and he had the kind of earnest open face that certain types of children take one look at and decide is an invitation. Ruth had seen it before. She had seen it in a lot of different places over a long life. She watched the older boy from the next street step into Cody's path and say something she couldn't hear from the gate. Watched Cody's shoulders come up around his ears. Watched him stare at the ground. She didn't intervene. Not then. She waited until it was over, until the older boy had walked away laughing, and Cody had continued down the sidewalk, chin-tucked, moving fast the way kids move when they're trying to get somewhere safe before they let themselves feel it. She called his name as he passed her gate. He stopped, looked at her with wary eyes that already knew the world sometimes made things worse when it pretended to make them better. She came out to the gate and crouched down slowly because of the knee, but she got there until she was level with his face. She looked at him for a moment without saying anything, the way people do when they're actually seeing you instead of just looking in your direction. Next time, she said, look him straight in the eye. Don't look at the ground. People keep doing something as long as they think they're invisible to you. You look at him like he's the most ordinary thing you've ever seen in your life. Not angry, just there, watching. Cody studied her through those crooked glasses. Does it work? He asked. Takes practice, she said, but yes. She stood back up, went inside and left him to think about it. It would be the last conversation they had before everything in Millhaven changed. And by the time it was over, Cody Reeves would understand exactly what she had meant. Now you need to understand Craig Doyle. Not the version that would emerge in news articles later, not the villain made simple for public consumption. The real version, because the real version is more instructive and more common than most people want to admit. Craig Doyle was 44 years old and had grown up in Millhaven, knowing exactly who he was and what he was worth, because the town had been telling him both things since he could walk. His father, Earl Doyle, had built the company that constructed roughly half the residential structures in a 30-mile radius over 40 years of honest work. Earl had been a straight-dealing, early-rising man who shook hands and meant it, who gave his workers Christmas bonuses even when times were tight, and who sat on the town council for 12 years without ever using his position to benefit his own business. People genuinely liked Earl Doyle, not because he was rich, because he was decent. Craig had inherited the money and the company, but not the character, and somewhere in his mid-30s, he had stopped pretending otherwise. He'd come to believe, or thought he'd come to believe, that what his father called decency was really just a strategy, and a slower one than what Craig had in mind. He owned properties all over Millhaven. 30 families in town rented from him. He sponsored the youth football program, the only organized athletics available to kids in the county, and he made sure everyone knew it. His closest friend since 9th grade was Sheriff Doug Pratt, and that friendship had been exercised quietly and without ever needing to be spoken aloud in ways that smoothed Craig's path more times than the official record would ever show. When people ran into problems with Craig Doyle, when their rent mysteriously increased the month after they signed a petition he didn't like, or when their permits got buried in a drawer at town hall for months with no explanation, or when a handshake deal that seemed solid suddenly fell apart without reason, they dealt with it by not dealing with it, by quietly adjusting, by learning the shape of the thing and deciding it was easier to move around it than through it. That was the ecosystem Craig Doyle had built in Millhaven. Not through dramatic cruelty, through accumulated small demonstrations of what happened to people who didn't understand the arrangement. Ruth Calloway had refused to understand the arrangement for 6 months. It had started simply. Craig wanted the lot at the end of Maple Street, her lot, because it sat adjacent to a parcel he already owned, and the combined acreage would let him put up a row of rental units that would generate significant income. He'd sent a man to knock on her door. She said no. He sent someone else with a higher number. She said no again. He came himself the third time, standing at her gate in a pressed shirt with a smile that had clearly gotten him very far in life. She had looked at him the way she looked at everything, calmly, completely, without hurry. "I'm not selling," she'd said. "Thank you for the offer." And she'd gone back inside. 2 weeks later, the fence along her back property line was damaged, 3 posts knocked out of the ground overnight, no witnesses. The following month, the permit she'd filed to reshingle her roof went missing at the county office and took 11 weeks to resurface. When she called to inquire, she was told there had been an administrative backlog. She wrote that down in her green notebook along with the date and the name of the person she'd spoken with. She wrote everything down. She hadn't called her sons. She hadn't wanted to. They had their own lives, real ones built with their own hands, and she refused to become a problem they had to solve. She was 71 years old and had navigated worse than Craig Doyle with nothing but patience and a clear head, and she intended to handle this the same way. She just hadn't anticipated that he would eventually get bored of the fence and the permits and decide to do something stupid in public. Wednesday morning, she parked in the Millmart lot at 8:15, same as always. Her list was short milk bread, 2 cans of black beans, a box of oatmeal, and a bottle of ibuprofen for the knee. She took a cart from the rack near the entrance and moved into the store at the pace her left leg allowed, not hurrying, not dawdling. Craig Doyle was standing in the middle of the center aisle. He wasn't there to shop. He was there to talk to Pete Lund, the store manager, about a lease agreement Pete had been resisting for weeks, a deal that Craig wanted, and Pete didn't lay it out in terms that were technically legal and practically coercive, and both of them knew it. Craig had Harlan and Sal with him, 2 men in their late 30s, who functioned primarily as an audience, which was all Craig had ever really needed from the people around him. He was standing with his back to the main aisle, talking loudly about something that wasn't the least the way men do when they want you to know they're comfortable taking up whatever space they want. Pete was nodding the way a man nods when he's calculating how long he has to keep nodding before it's over. Ruth steered her cart up the aisle. The wheel on the left side had a wobble. It pulled just enough to the right that when she navigated past Craig Doyle, the front corner of the cart grazed the heel of his shoe. Not a collision, a graze. The kind of contact that happens 40 times a day in a grocery store and means exactly nothing. Ruth stopped the cart. "Sorry," she said, direct the way she said everything. Not groveling, not defensive, just the appropriate response to an inadvertent moment of contact. She meant it, and it was already over. Craig turned around. He looked at her the way certain men look at women who remind them of nothing they've ever wanted to be. Slow, top to bottom, taking inventory. "You need to watch where you're going," he said. "I'll be more careful," Ruth said, and moved to go around him. He didn't move. This was where it could have ended, where it should have ended, where it would have ended in any room in the world where power was distributed differently. But Craig Doyle was standing in the one town where almost nothing had ever pushed back against him, and he had Harlan and Sal watching, and Pete Lund was standing 6 feet away, and 20 other people were scattered throughout the store, and something in that particular arrangement made him decide that stepping aside would cost him something he wasn't prepared to pay. "Where do you think you're going?" he said. Ruth looked at him. Not with anger. She had long since outgrown the kind of anger that shows on your face before you're ready to use it. Not with fear, with the same clear, unhurried attention she brought to everything, like she was reading a number off a wall. "I'm going to get my milk," she said. "This is my conversation you just walked into," he said louder, now loud enough for the surrounding aisles to hear. "You think you can just roll your cart through here whenever you feel like it?" The store had gone quiet, not all at once. The way it happens is person by person. The small noises of commerce fading as people register that the energy in the air has shifted into something that makes you stop moving and pay attention without quite knowing why. Pete Lund looked at the floor. Harlan and Sal looked at Craig. Ruth said, "The aisle is public. I didn't mean to bother you." Still calm, still just the facts. She moved to go around him. He spoke again, and this time he let the ugliness come up fully without disguising it as anything else. He talked about her shoes. He talked about her age. He made a remark about the canned beans in her cart in the tone of a man who has decided that reducing someone is easier than engaging with them. Each sentence was a step down, and with each one the silence in the store got heavier, and nobody in it did anything to interrupt it. The people of Millhaven had learned not to interrupt Craig Doyle. Ruth stood still through all of it. Not frozen still. There's a difference. Frozen is involuntary. Still is chosen. She let him finish, or thought she was going to. And then something he said, the precise wording of it, the casualness of the cruelty, the way he glanced at Harlan when he said it, checking for the laugh and getting it. Something in that sequence crossed a line she had not clearly identified until the moment it was crossed. She looked at him. The loudest man in a room, she said, is usually the most afraid of what he'd hear if it went quiet. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was just a thing she believed to be true, said plainly because she was 71 years old and had lived long enough to know there was no use in pretending otherwise. That was all it took. His hand shot out and hit the side of her cart, not the handle, the body, with enough force and enough intention that the cart swung hard to the right and took Ruth's balance with it. Her left hand lost its grip. Her right knee twisted, trying to compensate. Her left knee, the one that had been giving her trouble for 3 years, the one she hadn't had fixed because she was stubborn about that kind of thing, took the impact when she went down. The sound of her hitting the floor was different from the sound of the can. The can was just physics. The sound Ruth made was the sound of a person, specific and irreversible, and it went through the store the way sounds like that do, landing in the chest before the brain has time to process it. For a moment, the only motion in Milmart was the slow roll of the can of black beans across the linoleum, bumping gently against the base of a display of soup. Craig Doyle looked down at her. What crossed his face in that moment was not regret, not remorse or surprise, or even the calculation of consequence. It was something older and uglier, the brief reflexive satisfaction of a man who has demonstrated once again that he can. "Stay in your lane, old lady," he said. Then he turned back to Pete Lund. "Let's go over that contract." And he walked away. The first person to reach Ruth was a young man named Jimmy Holt, 28 years old, an electrician's apprentice who had been in the store buying lunch supplies and who moved before he'd consciously decided to, the way some people do when their body understands what a moment requires before their mind catches up. He knelt beside her and got his arm under her shoulder. She was not crying. That was the thing that stayed with Jimmy afterward. That was the thing he kept returning to, that he described when he told the story later. She was not crying. She wasn't in shock. She wasn't trembling. She was lying on the floor of a grocery store at 71 years old with a knee that had just taken a bad impact and a back that would be stiff for days, and her eyes were completely clear. She looked up at him with the expression of someone who is feeling something real and has decided for reasons of her own not to let it out in this room. "Thank you," she said. He helped her up. She was lighter than he expected, but not fragile. There was something in the way she found her footing and steadied herself that told him she had gotten up off the floor before in ways that had nothing to do with grocery stores. She reached down and picked up the can of beans, placed it back in the cart. Jimmy stood there, not knowing what to say, the uselessness of not having said anything earlier, settling onto him like a coat he hadn't chosen to put on. She looked at him for a moment, not with blame, just with that clear attention that seemed to be the way she saw everything. Then she pushed the cart forward and continued shopping. Jimmy watched her go. He was 28 years old and had lived in Millhaven his entire life, and he did not fully understand what he had just witnessed, but something in his chest felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Tighter, heavier, like a door that had been standing open for years had quietly swung shut. The store had started breathing again. People were moving. Small sounds were returning. Pete Lund had disappeared into the back with Craig, the transaction having apparently survived the interruption without trouble. Nobody said anything to Craig. Nobody said anything to each other. 23 people resumed their shopping. Ruth took her items to the register. Darla Spence was 22 years old and had been working the register at Milmart for a year and a half. She was the kind of young woman who felt things strongly and visibly, who had not yet learned or not yet chosen to suppress the evidence of what was happening inside her. Her eyes were red. She had watched everything from behind her register and had not spoken, had not done the dozen things she had subsequently gone through in her head, while the minutes passed and the moment became irreversible. She looked at Ruth with the face of someone who is already starting to understand that this morning is going to follow her. Ruth set her items on the belt. She looked at Darla steadily, not to smooth it over, but the way you look at someone when you want to make sure they're actually hearing what you're about to say. "This is not your fault," Ruth said. "None of it. You hold on to that." Darla's jaw tightened. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Ruth paid, took her bag, walked out. In the parking lot, she loaded her single bag into the back of the Ranger, got in, sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The knee was throbbing. Her lower back had already started to stiffen. She knew from experience from a long life that had included its share of physical indignity exactly how the next 48 hours were going to feel. And she was calculating it the way she calculated everything, practically without drama, deciding what needed doing first. She took her phone out of her jacket pocket, scrolled to the first name, called it. He picked up on the first ring, not because he'd been expecting it, but because Dax Calloway always picked up when his mother called. Always. It was the one rule he'd never needed to articulate because it had never needed to be articulated. She heard the familiar sounds in the background, the compressed air hiss of a socket wrench, the acoustics of a large garage space. Dax, she said. Millhaven, I'm okay. A pause, the length of a breath held and then released. Okay, he said. She ended the call. Scrolled to the second name, said the same 3 words, ended the call, scrolled to the third, 3 calls, 30 seconds total. She started the Ranger, backed out of the parking space, and drove home to make lunch. 240 miles to the north, in the back bay of the largest independent automotive garage in Tulsa, Dax Calloway put his phone in his chest pocket and lay still for a moment in the dark under a '68 Chevelle that had come in for a full restoration. He could hear his 2 senior mechanics talking in the front bay, the radio playing something country and indistinct, the ordinary sounds of a Wednesday morning. He slid out from under the car, stood, wiped his hands on the shop rag tucked into his back pocket the way he always did, thorough automatic. He was 48 years old, built wide across the shoulders from 25 years of physical work, with forearms that carried a record of every engine he'd ever pulled and every road he'd ever put behind him. His hair was dark with silver at the temples and pulled back from his face. He had a scar through his left eyebrow from an incident when he was 19 that had been at the time genuinely dangerous and was now just part of the geography of his face. He walked to the wall where his jacket hung on a hook, the one with the patch on the back, the one that had hung in the same spot since he'd built this garage, and took it down. His lead mechanic, a good man named Everett, who had worked with X for 11 years, came to the bay door and watched him put it on. Everett didn't ask any questions. In 11 years, he had learned to read the difference between Dax leaving because there was something to handle and Dax leaving for any other reason. This was the first kind. Take the afternoon appointments, Dax said. Already on it, Everett said. Dax walked to where his bike sat at the end of the row, a 2003 Road King he'd been riding since before this garage existed, a machine he understood the way other men understand the face of someone they've loved for decades, and got on it. He didn't call his brothers. They already knew. In Broken Arrow, Mick Calloway was eating lunch alone at his kitchen table when his phone lit up. He read the message Dax had sent, a single line, just the word and the town name, and sat with it for a moment. He was the middle son, 45. A welder by trade and by temperament, the profession suited him in that deep alignment between a man's patience and the work his hands do. Welding requires stillness, correct breathing, exactly the right amount of pressure at exactly the right time, and not a fraction more. He was shorter than Dax, less immediately readable than Cole, and he moved through rooms without drawing the eye. He was not the kind of man who needed to be seen to feel solid. People who underestimated him on first meeting rarely did so twice, and Mick had never found this worth correcting. He put his spoon down, picked up the phone, called Dax. I'll go ahead, Mick said. You come behind. Yeah, Dax said. That was the whole conversation. Mick finished his soup, all of it slow and deliberate because he had driven long distances in worse emotional states than this, and he knew the body needed fuel regardless of what the mind was doing. He rinsed the bowl, put on his jacket, texted 6 men whose numbers he kept for specific purposes. They would know what it meant. In Muskogee, Cole Calloway was standing in the center of a community gymnasium demonstrating a wrist release technique to a group of 12 women who ranged in age from 19 to 63. Cole was the youngest at 41. He kept his hair short. He wore flannel and work boots rather than leather. He had the kind of face that registered as trustworthy before it registered as anything else. Open and unhurried, the face of someone who listens before he speaks. People told Cole Calloway things they hadn't planned to tell anyone. He had come to understand that this was among the most useful things a person could carry. He had been teaching this class for free twice a week for 4 years. The women who came had been sent by shelters, by court advocates, by word of mouth, by other women who had taken the class and understood what it was actually teaching, not just the physical techniques, though those mattered, but the more fundamental thing underneath, that your body belongs to you, that you are allowed to defend it, and that the permission to do so doesn't need to come from anyone else. His phone was on the folding table by the door. The screen lit up without making a sound. He saw it from across the gym, the way people see things they've been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. He held up one hand to the group. Let's stop here for today. Same time next week. There was a murmur of surprise. He never ended early, but no one questioned it. Something in the economy of his movement as he crossed the floor made questions unnecessary. He picked up the phone, stepped outside into the afternoon light, called his mother, not his brothers. She picked up on the second ring. He didn't ask what happened or how bad it was or what she needed. He just listened to her voice, 3 sentences, composed and matter of fact, and let himself hear the thing underneath the composure that only a son would know to listen for. "I'm coming," he said. "I know," she said. That evening, a 34-year-old mechanic named Gary Tillman sat at his kitchen table for a long time staring at the video on his phone. He'd been in Millmart that morning. He'd been in the corner by the self-serve coffee machine, and he'd started recording about 45 seconds into the confrontation, not out of any journalistic instinct, but because something in Craig Doyle's voice had activated a reflex, a need to document a feeling that whatever was about to happen was the kind of thing someone should have on record. He'd watched it back 3 times since getting home. Each time he felt it differently. The first time, with the hot flush of retrospective anger. The second time with the cold weight of having done nothing himself. The third time with something he couldn't quite name that lived between the two. He sat there for a long time. Then he opened Facebook, found the Millhaven community page, and posted the video with a single sentence. "Happened this morning at Millmart. That's Craig Doyle. The woman is a 71-year-old resident. No one helped her." He put the phone face down on the table and didn't look at it for 2 hours. When he picked it back up, the video had been shared nearly 800 times. The comments were running hot outrage recognition. The viral energy of footage that confirms something people already knew was true, but one comment near the top had already been liked more times than the others. It was from an account Gary didn't recognize, with a profile picture he couldn't make out on his small screen. 4 words. "That's Iron Roy's wife." Gary stared at it. It meant nothing to him. He scrolled past it, back into the wave of outrage and the occasional voice defending Craig Doyle on grounds of context, and he didn't think about those 4 words again that night. But 3 streets over, in the house where Kenny Marsh had lived for 22 years, a 58-year-old man who had once driven long-haul routes through parts of the country that most people only saw from interstates, looked at the same comment and felt the blood drain slowly from his face. He'd been a young man the last time he'd heard that name. He'd been driving through Tulsa on a haul and stopped at a bar where men like Roy Calloway drank, and he'd heard the name used with a weight that people reserved for men who existed at a very specific intersection of loyalty, capability, and reputation. He hadn't thought about Iron Roy in 20 years. He set his phone on the arm of his recliner. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he turned to where his wife Connie was folding laundry on the couch. "Connie," he said, "you remember me telling you about Iron Roy, the man out of Tulsa?" She looked up, vaguely. "Why?" Kenny picked up his phone again, looked at the comment, looked at the short, grainy video of a small, silver-haired woman being knocked to a grocery store floor. "His wife lives at the end of Maple Street," he said slowly, "and I think Craig Doyle just put her on the ground." Connie stopped folding. "So," Kenny Marsh exhaled through his nose. He'd spent 20 years on the road moving through the country's veins, and in those years he'd learned to read situations the way you learn to read weather. Not through any single sign, but through the accumulation of small signals that taken together told you what was coming. "So," he said, "tomorrow is going to be a very different kind of day in this town." He turned off the lamp, went to bed, but he lay there for a long time in the dark before sleep came. 300 miles north, the sound of engines starting one by one, then in clusters, then in a low, steady chorus, moved through the Tulsa night like something about to become permanent. Ruth Calloway lay in her bed at the end of Maple Street, with an ice pack on her knee and the green notebook on the nightstand beside her, and she slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a woman who had made her 3 phone calls and knew exactly what came next. Mick Calloway drove into Millhaven at 3:47 in the morning. He came in from the east off the state road lights, low engine dropped to an idle that barely registered above the wind, moving through the flat country on either side of the highway. He had 5 men with him, not boys, not hotheads, men who had been in enough situations to know that the most powerful thing you can do when you arrive somewhere is arrive correctly. They spread out as they entered each bike, taking a different approach, moving through the sleeping streets of Millhaven, the way water moves through a space, finding the contours, understanding the shape of the place, settling into it without disturbing it. They did not go to Maple Street. They rode the perimeter first, the full circuit of the town, slow and thorough, noting what was where the sheriff's office, on Birch the Millmart lot, on Central the Doyle Construction Building, with its lit parking lot sign on the corner of 3rd and Main, the residential blocks fanning out from the commercial strip like spokes of a wheel that had never been perfectly round. They noted the one road in from the north that went past the water tower, the two roads from the south, one of which dead-ended at the grain elevator, the single east-west through road that was technically US 270 and technically the main street and technically the only way most people would think to move through this town if they needed to move quickly. Mick filed all of it without writing anything down because that was the kind of memory he'd always had, the kind that retained geography the way other people retain faces. At 4:20, they stopped. 3 bikes at the north end of Central Avenue. 3 bikes at the south end, engines off. The men sat or leaned and waited with the patience of people who understand that waiting is not the same as doing nothing. At 5:30, Virgil Crane came out to open his newsstand on the corner of Central and 2nd, the same corner he had been opening for 31 years, and found 3 motorcycles parked at the end of the block. Dark, still, no riders visible. He stood in the early morning quiet and looked at them for a long moment. Then he went inside, turned on his lights, put the papers out, and called his son in Ardmore. "You ever heard of the Callaways?" he asked. His son had not. "Look it up," Virgil said. "Call me back." His son called back 12 minutes later. Virgil listened for a while without saying much. Then he said, and thanked his son and hung up and stood there behind his counter with his coffee going cold and the morning light just beginning to touch the tops of the buildings across the street. At 6 o'clock on the dot, the main convoy entered Millhaven. It came from 4 directions at once. That was the part people in Millhaven would try to describe later and find they couldn't quite get right because it didn't match any frame of reference they had for how things arrived. Things arrived from one direction. Storms of news trouble, they came from somewhere specific and moved toward you. This was different. This was the town being entered from every side simultaneously, the sound building from all 4 points of the compass at the same moment, so that by the time you registered it was happening, it was already everywhere. 22 additional bikes, riding in pairs spaced evenly, moving at the exact same speed, unhurried, deliberate, the pace of men who are not running toward anything and not running away from anything, and who have thought about this more carefully than you have. They came down Central from the north and up from the south and in from the east along the highway and in from the west along the county road, and they met in the intersection in front of Millmart with the precision of something that had been planned because it had been. Engines off, 28 bikes, riders sitting still, the morning light catching chrome and leather and the patches on the backs of jackets that anyone in this country over the age of 40 would have recognized without needing to be told what they meant. When the last engine cut out, the silence that replaced it was total, not peaceful, but charged the silence of a room that has just been asked a question it cannot avoid answering. Dax was at the front. He got off his bike and stood beside it and did not do anything else. He wasn't there to march on anyone's door. He wasn't there to make speeches or demands or threats. He was there the way a fact is there, immovable, patient, requiring no performance to establish its existence. Mick was on his left. Cole was on his right. None of them spoke. They stood in front of the place where their mother had gone down on the floor the morning before, and they let the weight of their presence say everything that needed to be said. Virgil Crane stood in his doorway and watched. Down the block, a woman who had come out to retrieve her newspaper off the front step stood on her porch and did not bend down for it. Across the street, a man walking his dog stopped and did not start again for a full minute. In the apartment above the pharmacy, a light came on in a window. Millhaven was waking up to something it did not have language for yet. Craig Doyle opened his office window on the 2nd floor of the Doyle Construction Building at 7:15 and saw it. He stood at the window longer than he would have admitted to anyone. Then he went to his desk and called Doug Pratt. Pratt didn't pick up the first time. Craig sat with the phone in his hand and looked back out the window and called again. Pratt answered on the 3rd ring, and something in the texture of his voice was different from the usual easy morning manner. Flatter, more careful, the voice of a man who had been up for a while and hadn't resolved what he was thinking about. "Doug," Craig said, "you need to come down to Central. There's a situation." "I know," Pratt said. "I've been out here for 20 minutes. "Then do something about it. That's your job." A pause. Not the comfortable pause of an old friendship where silence is easy. A different kind. "Craig," Pratt said, "I need to ask you something straight. That video going around. Did you put your hands on that woman intentionally?" Craig felt something shift in his chest, not quite fear, not quite anger, something that lived between the two, and felt uncomfortably like the beginning of accountability. "That's not the issue right now. The issue is..." That's the only issue right now, Pratt said, and you need to know who that woman is. Roy Calloway's wife. You understand what I'm saying to you? He understood the words. He was still working on what they meant for the morning he was currently having. Pratt told him the number of times the video had been viewed overnight. Craig sat down in his office chair. You handle it, Pratt said, and there was something final in the way he said it, not wishing Craig luck, not promising backup, just placing the weight of it squarely where it belonged. Craig hung up, looked out the window at 28 motorcycles and the three men standing at the front of them. For the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, he did not know what his next move was. Ruth was in the kitchen when Dax came in. He used the key she'd given him years ago, the one that had lived on his hearing, through 3 different sets of pants and 2 different bikes. He came in through the back door and stopped in the kitchen doorway the way he always did, not entering the room until he had taken stock of it, an old habit that had begun as necessity and become simply the way he moved through the world. She was at the stove. Oatmeal, 4 portions. She heard him and didn't turn around. Sit down, she said. Coffee's made. He looked at her knee, which she'd rewrapped that morning with a compression bandage from the kit she kept under the bathroom sink. He looked at the way she was standing, slightly favoring the left, the hitch more pronounced than usual, but upright and deliberate. He sat. Mick and Cole came in 2 minutes later and took their usual places without being told the way. You take your place at a table you've been sitting at your whole life. The kitchen felt smaller with all 3 of them in it. It was a small kitchen built for one person's life, but not uncomfortable. Close in the way that matters. Ruth brought the bowls and the coffee and sat down. They ate. It was Dax who spoke first when the bowls were half empty and the light through the kitchen window had warmed from gray to yellow. He set his spoon down and looked at his mother. Why didn't you call sooner? Not a question, a statement with a question underneath it. She kept her eyes on her bowl for a moment. Then she looked up. Because I was handling it, she said. Handling it. Yes. Ma, the word came out with more weight than he intended. The word that was her name in his mouth, the word he'd used since he was old enough to string syllables together. Handling it doesn't mean not telling us. It does when telling you means pulling you away from your lives for something I have under control. You were on the floor of a grocery store, and now I'm in my kitchen eating breakfast. She said it simply without irony. She just said it because it was true. I called you when I needed you to know, not before. Cole, who had said nothing since walking in, put his coffee cup down. What do you need us to do? He said. Ruth looked at each of her sons in turn, the way she looked at things fully without hurry, without the distance that people put between themselves and things they don't want to actually see. Stand in the right place, she said. That's all, not more than that, in the right place. Cole nodded once. That was enough. Sheriff Doug Pratt was leaning against his cruiser in the Millmart parking lot when Dax walked over at 8:30. He had his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly, the posture of a man who had been standing in one place for a while and was still working something out. He was 51 years old, had been sheriff of this county for 9 years, and had been Craig Doyle's closest friend for 35. He had grown up in this town the same way Craig had, knowing the landscape, knowing the rules, knowing who owned what and who owed whom. He had used his friendship with Craig as a wind at his back for most of his career, not always in ways that were outright corrupt, but in ways that were reliably convenient, and the distinction between those two things had gotten easier to overlook with each passing year. He looked at Dax now and saw a man he did not know standing in front of a situation he had not prepared for, and he had the sensation of a person who has been standing on ice that has been cracking for a long time and has just heard the loudest crack yet. I need to know what you're planning, Pratt said. Dax stopped a few feet away. He was not a man who reduced distance as a tactic. He stood where he stood. We're visiting our mother, Dax said. We're parked in a public lot. We're not blocking traffic. We haven't raised our voices. He paused. You want to tell me what ordinance we're violating? I'm not saying you're violating anything. Then what are you saying? Pratt looked past him at the line of bikes, at the men sitting quiet and still, at the patches on the jackets which he knew and which the people of Millhaven knew, and which several news outlets that had picked up Gary Tillman's video were currently working into their framing. I'm saying this is a complicated situation, Pratt said. It's not complicated, Dax said. A man put his hands on a 71-year-old woman in a public place in front of 23 witnesses and walked away. That's a battery charge and a question about why nobody's moved on it yet. Pratt was quiet. Craig Doyle's been your friend for a long time, Dax said. Not accusatory, just accurate. I understand what that means in a town like this. He looked at Pratt directly without aggression, with the steadiness of someone who has no reason to perform anything. But there's a version of today where you're on the right side of this sheriff, and there's a version where you're not. That decision isn't mine to make. Pratt looked at the ground for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them both. I've been Craig Doyle's friend since the ninth grade, he said, and I've known for most of that time that he was the kind of man who made the people around him smaller. He said it the way confessions come out when they've been sitting too long, without elegance, without preparation. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it wasn't my place. He stopped, started again. I have a filing cabinet in my office with 42 complaint forms in it that were never fully investigated. People who came to me with problems and left with nothing. Dax said nothing. I can't undo that, Pratt said, but I can decide what I do today. A long moment passed between them, carrying the weight of all the moments that had led to it. Then decide, Dax said. Pratt nodded once, pushed himself off the cruiser, got in, and drove back to his office where he would spend the next 4 hours pulling a filing cabinet open for the first time in years. Pete Lund had been standing near the edge of the parking lot for 40 minutes before he walked over. He was the manager of Millmart. He had been for 7 years. He was 39 years old with a wife and 3 children and a mortgage on a house he'd gotten at a rate Craig Doyle had helped arrange, the kind of favor that never quite goes away. He had watched what happened in his store the morning before from 8 feet away and had looked at the floor and gone back to talking about the lease. He had not slept. He'd lain in bed while his wife breathed beside him and stared at the ceiling and gone through it again and again, the sound of Ruth hitting the floor, the roll of the can, the silence of 23 people deciding collectively not to be the one. He'd been one of those 23. He'd been standing closer than most. He walked across the parking lot and stopped in front of Cole. I was there yesterday, he said. No context, no softening, no explanation of the pressures or the debts or the years of navigating Craig's power. Just the facts stated plainly. Cole looked at him and waited. I have a kid in middle school, Pete said. Oldest one, 13. He asked me last night what I did at work. I told him it was a quiet day. He stopped. I don't know what you do with that. You don't explain it away, Cole said. You don't build a story around it that makes it easier to live with. You sit with what it was, and then you decide what you do next. Pete looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man in the middle of exactly that process. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a USB drive. The store has cameras, he said, 3 of them. 2 cover the center aisle from different angles. I pulled the full footage this morning unedited before I made any copies for anyone else. He held out the drive. It's clearer than the phone video, a lot clearer. Cole took it. There's something else, Pete said. His voice had gotten quieter and more certain at the same time, the way voices sound when a person has decided something and is speaking from the other side of that decision. I'll testify in court before a camera in front of whoever needs to hear it, whatever it takes. He held Cole's gaze. I should have said something yesterday. I can't say it then. I can say it now. Cole looked at him steadily. That matters, Cole said. That actually matters. Pete nodded. He didn't look relieved. There was no relief yet because relief was not the appropriate response to finally doing something you should have done the day before. But he looked for the first time since Wednesday morning like a man standing on the right side of himself. The morning moved through Millhaven slowly with the quality of light that makes everything look like it might be the same as yesterday, even when it isn't. But the people of Millhaven were out. On a normal Thursday, Central Avenue at 10 in the morning was half populated at most. Today, the sidewalks had people on them who were not there for errands. They were there because something was happening, and the sensation of something happening in a place where nothing much usually happens is one of the most compelling forces in ordinary human life. They kept a distance from the bikes. Not out of fear exactly, but with the uncertainty of people who don't yet know what role they're supposed to play in a situation whose script they haven't read. Jimmy Holt was the first to cross that distance. He came on foot, hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped about 10 feet from where Mick was standing. Mick turned his head and looked at him. Jimmy held the look without flinching. I was in the store yesterday, Jimmy said. Mick waited. I was the one who helped her up. A pause. I should have done more than that. Mick looked at him with an economy of expression that was not coldness, but precision, the face of a man who does not add more than a situation requires. You helped her up, Mick said. In a room where 22 other people stood still, that's where you started. Where you go from here is a different question. Jimmy stood there with that. Then he nodded and moved to a spot on the sidewalk where he remained for the rest of the morning. May Hutchins opened her diner at the usual time and then did something unusual. She made 2 full urns of coffee and carried them out to the sidewalk on a folding table with a hand-lettered cardboard sign for anyone standing for something today. She set it up and went back inside to run her restaurant. She didn't announce it. She didn't post about it. She just did it because it needed doing. Within an hour, someone took a picture of the sign and posted it, and by noon it had been seen by more people than lived in the entire state of Oklahoma. May didn't find that out until the following week, and she would have found it embarrassing had she been the kind of person who was embarrassed by doing the obvious right thing. Sandra Voss arrived just after 10. She was 38 years old and had been covering local news for the Millhaven Courier for 11 years, which meant she had spent 11 years at ribbon cuttings and school board meetings and occasional car accidents on US 270. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at jobs. They've slightly outgrown thoroughness, developed past the point where the work still challenged it. She had been collecting information about Craig Doyle for 2 years. Not officially, not with a deadline attached, on her own time out of the frustration of knowing a story existed and not being able to publish it because a story requires sources. And sources in Millhaven required a level of safety that had not existed as long as Craig Doyle's arrangement with Doug Pratt held. She had tenant complaint letters. She had 3 recorded conversations legal in Oklahoma, a one-party consent state, with people who described how Craig operated rent increases, arriving the month after someone filed a grievance permit, delays coinciding with property disputes. The town's institutional machinery quietly redirected to serve one man's interests for the better part of a decade. She had been waiting for something to change the calculus. She found Cole near the side of the building and introduced herself without preamble. "I've been reporting on Craig Doyle for 2 years," she said. "I have documentation. I haven't published it because the people who talked to me weren't safe enough to go on record." She paused. "I think that's changing." Cole looked at her. "Why are you telling me?" he said. "Because whatever happens next is going to happen faster and more publicly than anything this town has seen. And I want to make sure the complete story gets told, not just the parts that are easy to film." "The complete story," Cole said. "The pattern," she said. "Not just Wednesday morning. What made Wednesday morning possible? That's the story that actually matters." "You write the story you can stand behind," Cole said. "We're not here to feed anyone's narrative. We're here for our mother." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Cole nodded once. Took her card. Craig Doyle called his lawyer at 10:30 and was told that the camera footage Pete Lund had pulled was almost certainly going to be subpoenaed within 48 hours, and that the phone video of his confrontation with the television crew, a crew he had called himself a decision, his lawyer described in language that was professionally controlled but communicating something close to despair, had already been broadcast on 3 regional affiliates. He had done it in the belief that getting out in front of the story would let him frame it. He had believed this because it had worked before in smaller situations with local media he knew and could predict. This was not a smaller situation. The reporter from the Tulsa affiliate had arrived with questions built on the same footage and context that several million people had been reading since midnight, and when Craig began his prepared statement about organized intimidation and community disruption, she had waited until he finished and then asked, with the economy of a journalist who has done her homework, "The security footage from the store shows you looking around before you pushed Mrs. Calloway. Would you characterize that as a deliberate act?" Craig stood in front of the camera with his prepared statement dissolving and his lawyer's voice in his earpiece saying things he wasn't processing, and the sensation of a man who has said something in public that cannot be walked back. He turned away from the camera. He went inside. The footage of that turn traveled farthest and fastest. Not the confrontation in the store, not the parking lot statement, the turn, the walk away, the door closing. People who had never heard of Millhaven, Oklahoma, watched that clip through the afternoon, and what they read in it didn't require any context or narration. It was the exact body language of a man who knows in the deepest part of himself that he is wrong and who has chosen one final time not to face it. By 4 in the afternoon, 2 of Craig's largest commercial partners had contacted his office to say they were reviewing their relationship with Doyle Construction. By 5, a regional bank had sent a letter requesting a meeting to discuss an outstanding loan. Craig sat in his office and watched his phone and did not call anyone back. At 7:30, his phone lit up with his son's name. Tyler had been trying to reach him since early morning. The calls had come at intervals, not frantic, not escalating, just steady. The patience of a young man who had decided something and was following through on it. Craig watched the name on the screen until the call went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, Tyler again. Craig set the phone face down on the desk. Outside the window, the parking lot of Millmart was still full. The bikes were still there. The street lights had come on and they fell across chrome and leather, and the patches that meant something specific to everyone who saw them, and the town of Millhaven was quieter than usual at this hour, but not empty. There were still lights and windows on Central Avenue that were not usually lit at this hour. Still small groups of people on the sidewalk in the way they gather when the ordinary rules of a place have been suspended and something is being renegotiated in real time. Millhaven had not been broken or flooded or struck by anything violent. Nothing had been destroyed. Nobody had been arrested. Nobody had raised a voice in anger in the previous 12 hours. And yet the town felt entirely different than it had 2 days ago. The difference was not the bikes, or not only the bikes. Something that had been invisible had become visible. And once something becomes visible in a place where it has been invisible for a long time, the people who live there have to decide what they are going to do with the sight of it. They cannot unsee it. They can look away. They can find explanations and context, but they cannot unsee it. And that is a different kind of accountability than anything that happens in a courtroom. The people of Millhaven had watched a man knock down an old woman and walk away, and they had stood still. And now they were standing in a different configuration and asking themselves individually and together and in the wordless conversation that communities have with themselves in moments of crisis, what they were going to do with that. Virgil Crane locked his newsstand at 8 and walked home past the Millmart lot and stopped for a moment. He was 70 years old and had lived in this town for all of them, and he had his own accounting of the things he'd seen and the things he hadn't said. He looked at the bikes. He looked at the 3 Calloway brothers standing at the front. He looked for a long time. Then he walked the rest of the way home, sat in his kitchen, and wrote a letter to the county paper that had been composing itself inside him for about 20 years. It was not a letter about Craig Doyle. It was a letter about Millhaven, about what a town owes the people who live in it, about what silence costs, about the moral debt that accumulates when decent people wait too long. He wrote it in one sitting, 45 minutes. He sealed it and put it by the door to mail in the morning. In the house at the end of Maple Street, Ruth Calloway sat in her armchair with her leg elevated and her green notebook open in her lap. The lamp was on and the house was quiet, and she was writing in her careful, deliberate hand, adding to the record she had been building since the previous autumn. Dates, teams, names, what was said, what could be confirmed. The notebook was nearly full. She looked at the last few pages and thought about what was coming, and she felt the weight of it, not dread, not triumph. Something more complex than either, the weight of having chosen a long time ago to do things the right way, even when the right way was slower, and of finding yourself finally at the place where the slow way and the right way and the only way that actually holds were all the same road. She closed the notebook, set it on the side table. Outside in the direction of Central Avenue 28, bikes sat quiet in the dark. Tomorrow she thought they would finish what had started. Not with noise, not with the theater that certain kinds of power required to feel real. Just with the plain, durable weight of truth moved carefully into the right place at the right time. She had been building toward that weight for 6 months. She turned off the lamp and went to bed. Friday came in gray and still, the kind of morning that holds its breath. Cloud cover low and flat, no wind, the quiet of a town that has been awake longer than it has been asleep. At 6:15, Virgil Crane unlocked his newsstand, carried his folding chair out to the sidewalk, and set it down facing the street. He had been doing this for 31 years, opening the stand, going back inside, doing the work of the morning from behind the counter. He had never in those 31 years brought the chair outside and sat in it on the sidewalk before 9 in the morning. He sat down now, put his coffee on the ground beside him, unfolded his newspaper and held it in front of him without reading it, and looked at the street over the top of it. People on their way to wherever they were going noticed him, slowed down, a few stopped. One of them, a man named Gerald, who drove a propane truck and had never stopped to talk to Virgil Crane about anything of substance, pulled his truck to the curb and leaned out the window. "What are you doing out there, Virgil?" Virgil lowered the paper. "Watching my town decide what it is," he said. Gerald looked at him, then down the street toward Central Avenue, where the bikes were still parked in the Millmart lot, visible from here in the early light like a row of dark monuments. Then back at Virgil. He turned off the truck, got out, leaned against the hood with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street. Neither of them said anything for a while. By 7:30, there were 14 people on the sidewalk in front of Virgil's newsstand. Not a crowd, not a protest. Just people of the various ages and occupations and histories that made up Millhaven, standing in the same place on a Friday morning, because something had happened in their town, and they had not yet resolved it, and they understood, without it being said, that it needed to be resolved in public together, because that was the only way it would actually mean anything. Darla Spence came on her break from the Mill Mart at 8, still in her work apron. She stood near the back of the small group, and nobody asked her anything, but she was there, and the being there was a different feeling than the one she'd been carrying since Wednesday morning. May Hutchins brought out the coffee again. Jimmy Holt was there by 8:15, same jacket, same hands and pockets. He had not gone back to work the previous day after leaving the parking lot. He had gone home and sat in his kitchen for a long time without television, without his phone, and had thought with the clarity that sometimes comes when the noise of ordinary life is removed about who he was and what that meant in practice. He had arrived at some conclusions. At 8:40, a car from Tulsa pulled up to the curb and parked, and the person who got out was not anyone that the people of Millhaven recognized. He was 19 years old, medium height, dark-haired, wearing a flannel shirt that looked like it had been grabbed without much thought in the early hours of the morning. He had Craig Doyle's jaw and forehead, the structural inheritance that families pass down without consent, but his eyes were different where Craig's eyes had the quality of surfaces reflecting things back. Tyler Doyle's eyes took things in. He stood beside his car and looked at the group on the sidewalk, then at the Mill Mart lot. Then at nothing in particular, the way young people look when they are making the final calculation before a decision they've already mostly made. Cole saw him first. Cole had that quality, the ability to register the arrival of something important before the room around him had processed it, a form of attention that looked like patience and was actually something more specific. He turned his head at exactly the right moment and saw the young man getting out of the car and recognized what he was looking at. He walked over. Tyler looked up as Cole approached. He did not back up or shift his weight or do any of the things people do when they feel a threat coming. He stood his ground and met Cole's eyes and said before Cole could speak, "I'm Tyler Doyle." "I know," Cole said. Tyler's jaw moved once. "I want you to know I'm not here because anyone told me to come. My father doesn't know I'm here. I drove down this morning on my own." Cole waited. "I don't know how to say what I need to say," Tyler said. "I've been trying to figure that out for 3 hours on the highway." He paused. "I'm sorry for what my father did to your mother. I know I can't take that back for him. But I needed to say it to someone who would actually hear it." Cole looked at him, not sizing him up, not deciding anything about him based on his last name, actually looking at him the way Ruth Calloway looked at things, as if the looking itself was a form of respect. "You're not responsible for your father," Cole said. "I want you to be clear on that. You don't carry what he did." Tyler nodded. "But here's what I'll tell you," Cole said. "The question in front of you isn't about him. It never was. The question is what you build from here. What you decide you are separate from anything he is or was. That work starts today, not later, not when things are easier." He paused. "You drove 3 hours at 5 in the morning. That's a start." Something moved across Tyler's face that was not grief exactly and not relief exactly, but something in the territory between them, the sensation of being seen clearly by someone who has every reason to look away. "What do I do?" Tyler said. "Stand here," Cole said. "Don't perform anything. Don't make speeches. Just stand here and be present to what's happening in this town." Tyler nodded once. Cole walked back to the bikes. Tyler remained where he was, at the edge of the gathering on the sidewalk, not fully joining it and not leaving it. He stood there with the stillness of someone doing for the first time something that requires very little action and a great deal of courage. Virgil Crane noticed him from across the street. He folded his newspaper, set it on his chair, and walked over. He stopped in front of Tyler and looked at him for a moment. "You Earl's grandson," Virgil said. "Yes, sir." Virgil nodded slowly. "Earl was a good man," he said. "That's yours to do something with if you want to." He went back to his chair. Tyler stood on the sidewalk and thought about his grandfather, who he barely remembered, and about what it meant to inherit something from a person who was no longer there to explain what they intended it for. Craig Doyle's lawyer reached him by phone at 9:15 with a message that had the quality of a final instruction before the floor gives way. "You need to go out there," the lawyer said, "not to fight, not to defend. You go out there, you stand in front of those people, you acknowledge what happened, and you don't minimize it. It's your last window to do this on your own terms rather than having it done to you in a courtroom." "And if I don't," Craig said, "then this ends worse, in every measurable way." Craig was quiet. Craig, the lawyer's voice had the flatness of professional honesty at the cost of what the client wants to hear. You pushed a 71-year-old woman onto a floor in front of 23 people and a camera. The secondary footage shows intent. The coverage has gone national. Your business partners are pulling out. The bank is calling. Your son is standing in the parking lot of the store you pushed his grandmother in front of. A pause. There is no version of this where you win. There is a version where you handle it with some integrity and a version where you don't. I'd like to help you find the first one if you're willing to look for it. Craig said nothing for a long time. Then, all right, he put on his jacket, walked down the stairs of the Doyle Construction Building and out the front door and across 3rd Street and down 2 blocks to Central and into the Millmart parking lot. The lot held 50, perhaps 60 people spread across the lot, and surrounding sidewalk the size a town of 4,000 generates when something important is happening and a significant portion of its people have found a reason to be near the center of it. The bikes still in their positions. The 3 Calloway brothers at the front. Craig walked toward them. He was aware of the watching. He had been aware of it his entire life, had in fact spent most of it cultivating situations in which people watched him and confirmed what he wanted confirmed. He understood watching. But this was different, the attention of people who were not performing either approval or opposition, who were simply present in tracking what was about to happen with the alertness of a community that understood this moment was going to say something about who they were. He stopped in front of Dax. Dax did not move, did not change expression, did not offer anything in the way of adjustment or concession. He simply received Craig's arrival the way a wall receives something thrown against it. I came to speak to your mother, Craig said. She's not here, Dax said. I want to explain, he started. There's footage, Cole said. He had his phone in his hand and the screen facing outward, not held dramatically aloft, not waved, just angled, so that the people nearest could see it clearly, and the people beyond them could see that something was being shown, and the chain of attention that ran through the crowd pulled everyone's gaze toward it. The Millmart security footage. Clear wide color. Center aisle Wednesday morning. Ruth, Craig, the conversation. And then in the 5 seconds before he pushed her undeniable, unambiguous, requiring no commentary, Craig turning his head slowly from left to right, checking, making sure of what was around him before he did what he was about to do. Not an accident, not a reaction, a decision. Cole lowered the phone. 50 people standing in a parking lot on a Friday morning. The footage had done what clear footage does, it closed the argument before the argument could start. Craig looked at the phone, at Cole, at the crowd, at the bikes. He made one more attempt, the old reach for the position he'd always been able to find, the authority that had always been there when he'd needed it. I came here to resolve this like adults, he said. I'd like to talk about what happened and move forward. Mick Calloway spoke. In 2 days, Mick had not said a single word in any public space. He had stood where he stood and been what he was and let the weight of his presence do the work that presence does when it is grounded in something real. He had not engaged Craig's lawyer's representative. He had not spoken to the reporters. He had not said anything at all except to the people who were on the right side of the situation. He spoke now. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. You didn't come here to resolve anything, Mick said. You came here because you're scared. And being scared doesn't make you honest. It just makes you present. He looked at Craig without anger and without theater, with the flat clarity that a level brings to a surface when it tells you whether something is true. Being honest would be knowing the difference. That was all. Craig stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he turned. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a man defeated and retreating. Just a man who had arrived somewhere and found nothing he could use and who was now going somewhere else. He walked back in the direction he'd come from, and the crowd parted for him without any instruction to do so, and nobody called after him and nobody cheered. The crowd simply breathed again and turned to each other, and the morning began to sound like itself. Cole put his phone in his pocket. Dax looked at the space where Craig had been standing, and then at the sky for a moment as if calculating something. Then he said, I'm going to see Ma. He walked to his bike, got on, rode the 6 blocks to the end of Maple Street. Craig Doyle knocked on the gate of the house at the end of Maple Street at 2 in the afternoon. He had spent the hours between the parking lot and this moment doing the various things. His situation now required a long call with his lawyer, a call from a business partner that he took and another that he did not. A stretch of sitting in his office doing nothing, which was itself a new experience. He had also picked up the phone to call Tyler and held it for 3 minutes and put it back down. He wasn't ready for that. He understood he was going to have to get ready for it, but not yet. He had walked to Maple Street on foot. The drive would have been 60 seconds. He walked because something in him required the time, and he recognized the requirement without fully understanding it. Ruth was on the porch. She was in the low wooden chair she kept beside the geraniums, a glass of iced tea on the railing. Her left leg was resting on the small footstool she'd had for 15 years, the one with the needlepoint cover she'd made herself the winter after Roy died because her hands had needed something to do. She was not reading. She was not doing anything except sitting on her porch in the afternoon and watching the street. She looked at Craig when he reached the gate. He stood there, on his side of the fence. There was something different about him from all the previous times he had appeared in her life, the occasions when he'd come with proposals and numbers, and the confidence of a man who expected to be answered in the language of negotiation. He looked smaller. Not physically, he was still the same large man he had always been, but in some other dimension. Like a thing that has been relying on a fixed amount of space and has suddenly found the space reduced. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Craig," she said. He opened his mouth and she watched him try to find the beginning of what he had decided he was here to say. She watched him cycle through 2 or 3 openings that he rejected before they became words. "I came to apologize," he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. "Then stand differently when you say that," she said. There was nothing to sit on his side of the gate. She meant something else, that he should stop occupying the space the way he usually occupied spaces, filling them by default, claiming them without thinking. He understood it without being told, because it was not actually complicated, it was just new. He stood differently. "I'm listening," Ruth said. "What happened in that store," he started. "Was not an accident," she said. "It was not an accusation. Just accurate," said in the same tone she used for everything that was simply true. "The footage shows you looking first. You and I both know that." His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "No," he said. "It wasn't an accident." Something shifted in the air between them at the admission. Not a dramatic shift. Something quieter and more final, this change in a room when a lie that has been occupying space in it is removed. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said. Ruth set her iced tea on the railing. She laced her fingers together in her lap and looked at Craig Doyle with the full weight of her attention. "I don't need your apology," she said. "Not for myself." He looked at her. "I need you to apologize to the 23 people who were in that store and walked out having learned that silence is the appropriate response when someone is being hurt. I need you to apologize to Pete Lund for 7 years of pressure that made him into someone he didn't want to be. I need you to apologize to every family in this town who received a rent increase the week after they said something you didn't like." She paused. "And I need you to call your son." Craig said nothing. "Tyler drove 3 hours this morning because he's trying to find out what kind of man he is," Ruth said. "That's a question he should be asking you, not standing in a parking lot hoping someone else can answer it for him." She held his eyes. "Your father was a decent man. You've always known that. Decency is not a strategy, and it's not a weakness, and it doesn't cost what you spent 20 years convincing yourself it costs." Earl Doyle knew that. Somewhere in you, you know it too. Craig's face moved through something complex and unresolved. He stood at her gate and bore it, not trying to answer it, not deflecting it, just standing there and letting it land. "If you apologize to me and go home and nothing changes," Ruth said, "then your apology is just another transaction. And I have no use for that." She picked up her iced tea. "But if you go home and call your son and you start finding out what it actually costs to be decent in this town, not to own it, not to run it, but to be decent in it, then we don't need to have this conversation again." Craig stood at the gate for a long moment. Then he did something Ruth had not seen him do in any of their previous encounters. He looked directly at her, not with the appraising inventory of a man assessing an obstacle, not with the resentful challenge of a man who has been cornered, but with the genuine attention of someone who is finally looking at what he's looking at. "I'll call him," he said. He said it quietly, without the structural confidence that usually framed his sentences, just the words in the plainest voice he had. Ruth nodded once. The way you nod when something has been said that needed to be said and doesn't require celebration. He turned from the gate and walked back up Maple Street. Ruth watched him until he was out of sight. Then she sat with her iced tea and the geraniums in the afternoon light, going golden early the way it does at that time of year in that part of the country. She sat for a long time. The green notebook was in Cole's hands by 4 o'clock, passed through the family's attorney, who had driven down from Tulsa that morning and was currently sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and the focused expression of a man who has just realized that the case he thought he understood is substantially larger than he'd thought. The notebook was 61 pages long, front and back in Ruth's careful cursive, not rushed, not abbreviated, written with the thoroughness she brought to everything she decided was worth doing. It covered 6 months. It began the week after Craig Doyle's third visit to her gate, when she understood that he was not going to stop on his own and decided to build something that could stop him. Every contact. Date, time, what was said, who else was present. The 3 incidents with the back fence, she had photographs taken with her phone the morning after each, time stamped. The permit, the name of the county employee she had spoken to on each of 4 phone calls, and the exact language used each time. 7 of her neighbors identified by name and address who had described similar experiences, not in formal declarations, but in the ordinary conversations of neighbors, each one dated and described. She had spent one afternoon in the county courthouse reviewing public permit records and found 14 applications filed by other Millhaven residents that had been delayed or denied during periods correlating with known property disputes involving Craig Doyle. She had written down every case number. She had not known when she began whether she would ever use any of it. She had known only that it was the right thing to do to see clearly and to write down what she saw to create a record that existed independently of her own word, because she understood that in disputes between people like Craig Doyle and people like herself, word alone was rarely enough. The attorney looked up from the notebook. "How long did this take you?" And he said. "Evenings," Ruth said. 4 or 5 nights a week. It wasn't all at once." "When did you start?" "Last spring," she said, after the 3rd time he came to the gate. The attorney set his pen down for a moment and looked at her with the expression of a lawyer who has just understood that his client has done his job better than he would have. "This is going to matter," he said, "not just for your case. This is the documented foundation for 8 or 9 separate civil actions." "I know," Ruth said. "That's why I was thorough." He picked up his pen and went back to his notes. At the kitchen table in the house at the end of Maple Street, 4 people sat with coffee, a legal pad, the ceramic rooster, the green notebook open to its final pages, and the attorney explained in the careful language of his profession what came next and what it would look like and how long it would take. Ruth listened. She asked 3 questions, each precise, each indicating she had already been thinking about this process in practical terms. Dax and Mick and Cole sat and listened and did not ask questions because they did not need to. Their mother had prepared for this with the same thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered, and what was needed from them now was not strategy, it was presence. That was enough. That evening, the bikes were prepared to leave. It happened without announcement or ceremony. The men who had come to Millhaven 2 days earlier began the practical work of departure, checking fluid levels, pulling on jackets, the quiet, organized movement of people who have done what they came to do. On Central Avenue, in the deepening dark, a few people remained on the sidewalk. Not a crowd. The crowd had dispersed through the afternoon into the ordinary life of the town. But a few people were there, as if they had found themselves unwilling to be somewhere else during the departure. May Hutchins stood in the doorway of her diner with her arms folded against the October air. Virgil Crane was at his corner, the stand locked up, but himself still present. Jimmy Holt was there, and Darla Spence still in her work apron from the closing shift. Pete Lund came out of the Mill Mart at 9 after finishing the evening inventory, and when he saw the bikes moving, he stood on the sidewalk and watched. The convoy assembled and began moving through the lot and out onto Central. Slow, unhurried, the same pace as arrival, deliberate, without performance in either direction. Dax led the line. As the convoy moved north on Central, it passed Maple Street, and Dax turned his head toward the end of the block, where the light in the front room of the small house was still on. He slowed almost imperceptibly as he passed the turn, not stopping, not signaling, just a slight reduction in pace that was barely visible to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. He placed his right fist briefly against the left side of his jacket over his chest. One motion, simple, gone. In the front window of the house at the end of Maple Street, Ruth Calloway stood with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and watched the red taillights of her son's bikes until they turned north on the highway and the dark took them. She stood there for a while after the lights were gone, in the quiet that a house holds when people who belong in it have just left it. Not emptiness. The echo of presence. Then she turned off the porch light and went to bed. The civil complaint was filed in district court the following Tuesday. Ruth Calloway, plaintiff, represented by the family's attorney out of Tulsa. The claim was battery, intentional, documented, witnessed. The security footage from Mill Mart. The phone video. 14 named witnesses, including Pete Lund, Darla Spence, Jimmy Holt, and 7 others who had been in the store that Wednesday and who had, in the days following, decided that being a witness to something and being willing to say so were two different categories of person, and they no longer wished to be in the first one without also being in the second. Attached to the complaint as a supporting exhibit was a 61-page document cataloging 6 months of related conduct. The attorney's cover note described it as the most organized, independent evidence compilation he had seen prepared by a non-attorney in 22 years of practice. 3 weeks later, Sandra Voss published her piece in the Millhaven Courier. It ran nearly 4,000 words and was not primarily about Wednesday morning in Millmart. It was about the years before it, about the specific mechanics of how one person's power left unchecked by the institutions that should have been checking it reshapes the life of a community in ways that become invisible through repetition. It named names and cited records and quoted 7 people on the record who had never previously been willing to go on the record, and it ended with a question the article had been building toward from its first sentence: what does a town owe the people who live in it quietly, without leverage, without connection, in the expectation that the place they chose to make their home will treat them as if they belong there? Sandra had been waiting to write that piece for 2 years. The waiting had made it better. She knew exactly what she wanted to say and said it without a wasted word. Doug Pratt served out his term and did not file for re-election. He spent the final months working through the filing cabinet, the 42 complaint forms, the years of deferred accountability. Not all of them resulted in action. Some were too old, some the evidence insufficient. But he went through every one of them, and the going through was itself a form of accounting, the kind that happens in private and leaves no visible record except in the person doing it. He told a friend 6 months later that he was sleeping better. He was. Pete Lund continued managing Millmart. He renegotiated his lease in January of the following year, and the new terms were fair. He began in small and practical ways to be the version of himself he had been not quite being for 7 years. When someone dropped something in his store, he was moving toward them before he had consciously decided to move. Darla Spence enrolled in the pre-law program at the community college in the spring. She drove 40 minutes each way 3 evenings a week after her closing shifts. She had not told Ruth Calloway about this. She sent a card simple from the grocery store, nothing elaborate, with a single line inside: "You were the first person to tell me I had nothing to be ashamed of." Ruth read it at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. She sat with it for a while. Then she put it on the counter near the ceramic rooster where she could see it when she was cooking. The civil proceeding concluded in spring. Craig Doyle did not go to prison. Civil proceedings are not how that works. And even the criminal battery charge, which was eventually filed and resolved, did not result in incarceration. The law is imperfect. It has always been imperfect. Ruth Calloway was old enough and experienced enough to have no illusions about that. What the civil judgment required was specific financial damages to be paid. The establishment and initial funding of a tenants advocacy fund to be administered independently, available to Millhaven residents with housing disputes against any landlord. And a public statement to be read aloud at a Millhaven Town Council meeting, not written by the plaintiff, not choreographed for maximum humiliation, but written by Craig Doyle himself in his own words, without a temple. It took him 3 drafts. The third one was not eloquent. It was not the statement of a man who had arrived at wisdom through suffering and emerged transformed. It was the statement of a man who had done something wrong and was saying so with the awkwardness of someone for whom that was genuinely new territory. Ruth thought the third draft was the right one for exactly that reason. Tyler Doyle sat in the back row of the town council chambers for the reading. He had driven down alone. He had not told his father he was coming. He sat with his hands on his knees and listened to Craig Doyle's voice working its way through 3 paragraphs that had taken 3 drafts to become honest, and he did not look at his father's face while the words were being said. He looked at the back of Ruth Calloway's head. Silver hair pulled back, simply the slight tilt that meant she was listening with her full attention. When it was over, Tyler waited until the room had mostly cleared. Then he walked up and stopped beside her. "Thank you for what Cole said to me," he said. "I know it came from you." Ruth looked at him for a moment, not appraising him, just seeing him clearly. "It came from him," she said. "He said it because he meant it." A pause. "But I'm glad it landed." She picked up her coat and walked out. Tyler stood in the emptied chamber for a moment. Then he followed her out into the evening and turned in a different direction toward whatever came next. In the morning, Cody Reeves put on his backpack and walked to school. He went down Maple Street past the gate of the house with the geraniums, past the spot where for weeks he had been managing the specific dread of knowing what waited for him at the corner where Spruce crossed Second. the older kid, the comments about the glasses, the small daily inventory of diminishment that had been quietly educating him against his will in the lesson that some people teach and some people receive and nobody profits from. He walked. At the corner of Spruce and Second, the older kid was there. Cody's feet wanted to slow. The old reflex, the one that had been developing since August, the one that pointed his chin toward the ground and made him smaller. He felt it. He knew it the way you know a habit from the inside. He kept walking at his normal pace. When he was close enough, he looked up. He looked straight at the older kid, not in anger. He felt something more complicated than anger, something that had a lot of things mixed into it, including fear, if he was honest. But underneath the fear, something steadier, something that had been put there by a conversation at a gate on a Tuesday afternoon, by a woman who had sat down to be at his level even though her knee hurt, and who had told him the truth in a plain way. He looked straight at the older kid at eye level, as if the older kid were the most ordinary thing he had seen all day. Just there, being seen. The older kid said nothing. Cody walked through and kept walking. He did not look back. Not because he was performing confidence or trying to look a certain way. He didn't look back because there was nothing behind him that required his attention. What was in front of him was where he was going, and that was where his eyes needed to be. He walked all the way to school without stopping. Ruth Calloway drove home to the end of Maple Street that evening after the council meeting, parked in her driveway, sat in the truck for a moment the way she sometimes did after a long day, not because she needed to, but because some days deserve a moment before you let them go. The porch light was on. She always left it on. She went inside, put her keys on the hook, filled a glass of water at the kitchen sink. The ceramic rooster, Darla's card, the salt shaker, the small green notebook now full replaced on the table by a new one, blue, this time because the hardware store had been out of green and blue was fine. She stood at her kitchen window and looked out at the back garden and the fence along the south property line, repaired now, the posts set properly in concrete, done by a company from the next town, because she had decided finally to spend the money. She had moved to Millhaven 7 years ago because she wanted ordinary days. She had gotten them. Not uninterrupted, nothing in her life was ever uninterrupted, but she had gotten them, and she intended to keep getting them, and she had the confidence of a woman who has learned over 71 years in 7 states, and a life that had required most of what she had, that ordinary days are not given to you. They are built carefully out of whatever the world makes available, which is sometimes difficult material, which takes longer than you plan, which requires more than you expected. But it holds. She turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall to her room, set her alarm for 6:30 because tomorrow was Tuesday, which was one of her grocery days, and she had a list to write before she went to sleep. Outside on Maple Street, the evening was quiet in the way that evenings in small towns are quiet, the richness of a place that has found its particular scale and settled into it. A dog somewhere, a car at the far end of the block, the wind moving through the old trees along the road with the sound of something patient and permanent. Millhaven was not a transformed town. Transformation is a word for before and after, and what had happened here was less like a before and after and more like a shift in a long ongoing process, a moment when something that had been pointing in one direction turned slightly and began pointing somewhere else. Towns are slow, people are slow. Change in a place where people have been living for generations, built their habits and relationships around unspoken arrangements, does not happen in a week or a month or even a year. But something had turned. The filing cabinet in the sheriff's office was open. Pete Lund walked toward people who fell. Darla Spence drove 40 minutes 3 nights a week. Tyler Doyle was learning how to make phone calls that were hard and make them anyway. Virgil Crane had mailed a letter that had been sitting in him for 20 years. And somewhere in the town, a tenants advocacy fund was accepting its first applications from people who had never had anywhere to bring their problems before. And at the end of Maple Street, in the house with the porch light on and the geraniums by the front steps, Ruth Calloway lay in her bed with her left knee on a pillow and a new blue notebook on the nightstand, and she slept the untroubled sleep of a woman who had done what was needed in the right way at the right time, and who would be up at 6:30 to write her grocery list and get on with the ordinary, durable, irreplaceable work of her days. In the morning, Cody Reeves would walk to school with his eyes up. That was enough. That was exactly enough.